Hey, hope you're doing well. I basically just wanted to make this video real quick just to touch on something that Tim Pool mentioned. He's mentioned it a couple times, and I don't want to necessarily call him out, but it's a very common thought in American, mindset right now. And I really wanted just to comment on it in case it helps someone kind of see the world a little differently. Basically, Tim Pool said in one of his recent videos that the founding fathers didn't know what they wrote when they wrote it down, when they said all men are created equal. They didn't know the impact it would have. And I totally disagree. He basically thinks that when the founding fathers, I don't want to say that, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he goes on to explain that all men are created equal, laid the groundwork to free blacks and bring equality to women and Native Americans, and the founding fathers didn't really realize what they had written down at the time. I want to disagree. The founding fathers were radicals. They were incredibly radical. But as any good radical knows, you have to compromise with the reality that you have today. Unfortunately, or as it turns out, we are unable to just start a society from nothing. We can't take everyone and then pretend like hierarchies don't exist or that social classes or cultures don't exist. We can't all start off speaking the same language anymore. It's too late for that. These things already exist, and the founding fathers put their ideals in the Constitution and then compromised with reality from there. A lot of people say, well, if the founding fathers weren't racists, why didn't they free their slaves? It's very simple. The British Crown made it illegal to free your slaves. If you freed your slaves, not only would you get punished, not only would they take your property away, but slaves were considered property during that time. So they would take your slaves away from you, and the slaves you just freed would then become someone else's property because the government would then give them to someone else. And your slaves would actually end up in a much worse position than they were before. So everyone had to kind of do this calculus in their mind. It was illegal to free your slaves because of the crown, and even after America separated from the British Crown, a lot of people did free their slaves, and the local governments, the state governments, actually many of them made it illegal to free their slaves as well. So during the founding fathers' lifetime, almost all of them lived 100% of their lifetime under a regime that made it illegal to free your slaves. So the best you could do was provide, the best experience you could for them and move on, and while it would have been much better had the slaves experienced freedom, and while slavery is a tragedy and it is a genocide and it is in no way justified, the founding fathers didn't know that slavery could be ended. Keep in mind that this had literally never been done before in human history. There was never a culture. Every great culture had been built using slaves, and there was never a culture that had turned around and freed their slaves at that point. So people didn't know if you could free slaves and have a working society. Think of slavery a little bit like we see the car today. There's plenty of environmentalists who believe that cars destroy the environment, that they lead to global warming, which will kill all of us in 15 years. Tim Pool is a little bit of a climate alarmist as well. Look, for all of the leftists who believe in global warming, none of them have the courage to recommend that we stop using the internal combustion engine tomorrow. We don't know how to make society work without the internal combustion engine as it is. So, environmentalists will make compromises. They'll use a car that has a higher mile per gallon. Maybe they will, ride a bike. Maybe they'll take public transport. But all of this is avoiding the fact that they live lives that depend on the internal combustion engine. They get food from grocery stores that was delivered using the internal combustion engine. They live in houses that were built using the internal combustion engine. All of these are compromises with reality as it is. You're not going to get everyone in the world to agree to just stop using fossil fuels tomorrow. So living in that world and living in a world that is net positive for carbon emissions, how you live the best life and the most ethical life you can live. And a lot of environmentalists drive cars, and a lot of them live in cities, and a lot of them have a net positive carbon emission footprint. So it's just one of those things like that. The way we look at slaves and slave owners today, that's how they're going to look at us in the future. and not just because of progress. And this is a very unfair way to look at people. It shows very little empathy. People believe for some reason that if they were alive during slavery, if you were, Benjamin Franklin, or if you were George Washington, that you would do things differently, that you would have freed your slaves. It's just not true. They did everything they could, and they were constrained by the laws of their time. They were constrained by the attitudes of their time. You're dealing with a time where people weren't the nicest to ex-slaves. A lot of slaves didn't have the ability to read, the ability to write, the ability to do simple mathematics. Freeing someone, and there were many instances where you could do more harm than good, especially when freeing a slave was still illegal under the crown and under the laws of many states at the time. If you free someone and you're caught breaking that law and you're fined, and the government takes away your property, they might take your slaves and give them to someone else. And now your slaves are in the hand of a much less sympathetic master. Not only that, but if you have a family of slaves that get taken because you decide to disobey government laws, that family might be split up. And then all of a sudden you are in a situation where, because you tried to do the right thing, you end up in a much worse situation for the people you were trying to help. So, there's all these compromises that the founding fathers made, with reality. And I really want people to think, whenever you look back at slavery, and of course it was a genocide, of course it was, humanity would have been much better off had they just bitten the bullet and just freed all the slaves all at once. But we know that now. That's with the benefit of hindsight, of 150 years of hindsight. We can tell that would have been the right decision. At the time, it had never been done. They studied the Roman Empire, they studied the Greek Empire, they studied all sorts of different cultures. They were incredibly intellectual. They're incredibly well-read people, much more than today, than people today. Much more well-informed than even college professors today. People believe that somehow if they went back in time and argued with George Washington, that they would have won the argument on slavery. It was just a different time. And it would be just like asking people today, trying to convince them with your words that they should give up the internal combustion engine, not just driving a car, but using any products that used fossil fuels in their production. Try and convince someone that, and tell them the quality of life they're going to have, and the amount of work they're still going to have to produce, and the amount of consumption they're going to be able to have. It's not going to happen. And that was the same attitude back then. And this is why you've got to be, it's very important to look at history and have a lot of empathy for the people in the past. It was a different time, it was a different place, there were different ideological structures. They referred to slavery as having, a wolf by the ears. You don't want to do it, it's extremely cruel, you wish you weren't in that situation, but if you let that wolf go, it might turn back and attack you. And that was a situation that they believed they were in. They believed that at the time when they were trying to become free of the British government, and again, freeing your slaves was illegal under the British government. Had they freed slaves as well during that time, which would have been the right thing to do, at that time, just gone for it. Realistically, a lot of the aristocrats, a lot of people with military knowledge, with the ability to finance a war, with the ability to procure weapons, a lot of the power elite at the time who owned slaves, would have turned on the fledgling government. That in no way the Constitution would have been ratified at that time. So you have this situation where, do we lay the groundwork and plant the seeds for freedom in the future? A freedom that we can't have right now, or do we go all in, and do we fight for what's right? Do we do the right thing? They leaned on the side of being practical, of compromising with reality to lay the groundwork for what can be done in the future. And you can't hold this against them. Realistically, their lives were on the line. They would have been hanged had this not turned out the right way. All of their names were on that paper. And it's very arrogant to think that had you been in that room, had you been faced with that decision, that you would have signed your name to that paper knowing that you would die because your countrymen wouldn't have stood alongside you had you been that radical. All of that being said, all of that being said, I really want people. The main point of this isn't that the founding fathers were great, even though they were, or that slavery wasn't evil, even though it definitely was and is today. The whole point is to have empathy for other people and to really take time to see things from their point of view. Um, a lot of people don't. Ideology is something where you can't see your own ideology, and because of that, it makes it very easy for us to criticize people of the past and not to take them seriously. And it's really important to understand other people because it helps you see the flaws in your own thinking. You could go on forever about the ideology of various Muslim leaders and how maybe it wasn't that they were ignorant and we're intelligent. Maybe they were right and we're wrong. And it's always important to reflect on that. As far as you know, the Chinese have a very different understanding of government than we do in the West. And maybe they're right and maybe we're wrong, or maybe we're right and maybe they're wrong. And it's always important to question yourself. As far as the question of slavery, I always think to myself like, cotton back then was a lot like oil is today. And what would it take for people en masse to protest oil and to refuse to consume oil? This is what the Christians eventually did. The evangelicals at the time. This is the movement and the boycotts that they led. But it was inconceivable. Within one generation, ending slavery went from inconceivable to real. And it's how fast humans can change. And hopefully we can have other changes that quick. But no one realistically says we should stop consuming oil today. If there was a law passed that food wouldn't be in the grocery store, people couldn't heat their houses, people couldn't drive to work, mass economic collapse, there would be violence and riots in the street. Even if America went and committed to that kind of lifestyle where we decide we're all going to consume nothing, just the bare minimum because we refuse to use fossil fuels, we're all going to become subsistence farmers because that's the lifestyle we'd have to live. What would stop Mexico or Canada or China from invading our country, taking over our resources, and then exploiting them even worse than we're exploiting them now? China produces much more pollution than the United States does at the moment. So it's just one of those things like, do we do what's right? Do we stop consuming oil because climate change is bad, or do we compromise with reality and say, hey, let's invest in alternative energy, let's live closer where we work so we commute less, let's try and use sustainable farming methods, so that we can live closer to our ideal. That's how almost 100% of the people today compromise with reality, and that's also what the founding fathers were doing as well. Long story short, was slavery evil? Yes. Were the founding fathers ignorant of what they were putting down on paper? Absolutely not. They knew exactly what all men are created equal meant at the time, and we're still playing it out. Hopefully we get there. We're not all equal yet in the eyes of the government. At least statistically, there's different outcomes and everything. On paper we are, but laws aren't enforced equally. Hopefully we get there. So that's the hope. We still have a lot more to go, but never underestimate the people of the past, because a lot of times it doesn't turn out. It's not that we're much smarter. Technology has allowed us to succeed and to achieve what we achieve with being much less smart, much less dedicated, work a lot less hard. So it's just one of those things. Anyways, if you actually see this, Tim Pool, I'd really appreciate it. Hopefully this is a little meditation. If it helps anyone, just let me know in the comment section. Have a great day. Bye.